It was July 4th, 1833, and the masters of Natchez believed themselves untouchable. They spoke of liberty. They toasted to freedom. They laughed until the walls shook. But in the kitchen, a woman stood at the stove, her hands trembling as she stirred. Her name was never carved into marble. No statue remembers her face. But that night, she became a shadow of vengeance. In her apron pocket, wrapped in cloth, was a powder. Pale, bitter, silent, and with each stir of the spoon, she folded death into the stew. By sunrise, 12 men would be dead. Half the town would fall sick, and Natchez, the jewel of Mississippi, would tremble under whispers of poison. She had no name in the record books, only fragments. The cook, the enslaved woman who worked in the master's house. Property. But she was more than that. She was born into chains, her first breath drawn under the shadow of another man's power. As a child, she had carried buckets too heavy for her frame, the wood cutting into her shoulders until her skin was raw. She learned quickly that tears meant nothing, and silence was safer than truth. The kitchen became her prison and her refuge. It was where she scrubbed floors until her knees bled, where she ground spices until her fingers blistered, where she cooked feasts she would never taste, platters of meat she would never eat. Each day she worked in the heat of the fire, her skin slick with sweat, her hands rough with burns. She knew the smells of the kitchen better than she knew her own reflection: smoke, grease, blood, iron. The masters praised her skill, but never saw her face. To them, she was a tool, nothing more. But behind her eyes burned something they could not touch. She carried scars no one could see. A brother whipped until his back was raw. A sister sold south, never seen again. Nights filled with muffled sobs in wooden cabins, where dreams of freedom clashed with the reality of chains. And somewhere inside her, a decision hardened: she would not die a tool. She would not leave this world without striking back. Natchez in 1833 was a city swollen with wealth. Cotton was king, and the Mississippi River was its throne. Steamboats choked the docks, unloading barrels of sugar, tobacco, and the luxuries of a world built on human bondage. On the bluffs, mansions rose in white stone and brick, their columns tall and proud, built by enslaved hands that would never step inside. Beneath them stretched fields of cotton, acres upon acres of white stretching like endless snow. For the white elite, Natchez was a paradise. For the enslaved, it was a cage. Every morning, the bell rang before dawn. Men marched into the fields, bent under the sun until their bodies nearly broke. Women cooked, cleaned, raised the master's children, and returned to shacks that barely kept out the rain. Whippings cracked like thunder. Shackles clanged like music. Hunger gnawed at stomachs, but silence gnawed harder. And yet, in the quarters at night, there was sound, soft singing, low hums, songs of sorrow, songs of resistance, songs that carried whispers of hope, even when hope was forbidden. The 4th of July meant nothing to them. It was the day the masters celebrated liberty, the liberty they had stolen from others. To the enslaved, it was a day of bitter irony. They cooked the food, set the tables, cleaned the floors, and watched as men toasted to freedom that was never theirs. But in 1833, one woman decided this day of false liberty would be repurposed. It would be remembered for something else. It started as whispers, carried like smoke across the quarters. News of rebellions in faraway places. Haiti, where enslaved men and women had risen with fire and blade, tearing down the masters and declaring freedom. Nat Turner in Virginia, who had struck just 2 years before, leaving blood in his wake. Every story was dangerous, every whisper a risk, but every tale planted a seed. She listened, she learned, she imagined. In the kitchen, her life was different from the field hands. She heard conversations others could not. The masters spoke freely in her presence, as though she were invisible. She learned their patterns, their habits, when they laughed, when they drank, when their guard was down. She studied food the way others studied scripture. She knew how to season a stew so it bloomed with flavor. She knew how to sweeten pies until they sang with sugar. She knew how to mask the bitterness of herbs so well that even the sharpest palate would be fooled. And she knew of poisons. Some were whispered about in the quarters, plants that sickened the cattle, powders traded in secret, bitter roots that could twist a man's stomach in knots. When she first touched the powder, her heart nearly stopped. Just holding it felt like holding fate itself. For weeks, she hid it, wrapped in cloth, buried beneath flour sacks. She told herself she would wait, that the moment would come. And then came the announcement. The master would host a grand banquet for the 4th of July. The finest families in Natchez would attend. Politicians, businessmen, men who controlled the lives of thousands. It would be a feast of liberty. And she decided it would also be a feast of death. She woke before the sun, the air heavy with summer heat. Her hands shook as she lit the fire, the flames snapping like teeth. All day she cooked. Ducks roasted, their skin blistering golden. Pork simmered in its juices. Stews bubbled, thick and fragrant. The sweet scent of pies filled the kitchen. She moved through the motions, but every step felt louder. Every sound sharper. The scrape of the knife, the hiss of fat, the crackle of fire. And then came the moment. She reached for the cloth. Her fingers brushed against the powder. Her heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst. She opened the pouch. The powder shimmered faintly in the light, like dust, like ashes. She tipped it into the pot, stirred once, twice, 3 times. The bitterness vanished beneath the stew's richness. She tasted nothing. She smelled nothing. But she knew. She knew what she had done. Her hands trembled as she wiped the spoon clean. Sweat slid down her face. For a moment, she nearly fainted. One slip, one wrong glance, and she would be dragged out, beaten, hanged before the guests even arrived. But then she thought of her brother, her sister, the countless faces bent under whips, crying into the night, and the trembling stopped. Her eyes hardened. She stirred the pot once more. By evening, the house blazed with light. Carriages arrived in a parade, wheels crunching against gravel. Silk gowns swept the steps. Boots clattered across the floorboards. Voices boomed with laughter. In the kitchen, she stood, her hands clasped, her apron stained. The bell rang. The doors swung open. Servants carried the dishes out one by one. Platters of duck, bowls of stew, pies gleaming under candlelight. The masters raised their glasses high. Fireworks cracked in the night sky, bursting in red and white. And in the shadows, she whispered to herself, almost like a prayer, "Tonight, the chains break." The dining room of the master's house gleamed like a shrine. Crystal chandeliers scattered light across the long mahogany table. Silverware glistened. Wine glowed ruby in tall glasses. The men of Natchez had gathered in full pride that night. Planters, judges, merchants, and overseers, every one of them fat with power. Their wives glittered beside them, silk gowns rustling like whispers. The air was heavy with perfume, cigar smoke, and the sweet tang of roasted pork drifting in from the kitchen. At the head of the table, the master raised his glass. His voice boomed over the hall. "To liberty," he declared. "To our great nation, and to the prosperity of Natchez." The men roared in agreement. Glasses clinked. The sound rang sharp, like bells in a cathedral. In the kitchen doorway, the cook stood silent. Her face revealed nothing, but her eyes never left the food. The servants moved quickly, trained in silence. Platters of duck, bowls of stew, golden pies. Every dish steamed hot, placed before men who barely glanced at the hands that served them. The master dipped his spoon first. He tasted it, then smiled. "Perfect, as always," he said. And the table followed. Spoons clattered against bowls. Knives cut through roasted meat. Laughter rolled like thunder. The cook turned her back, returning to the fire. But her ears strained for every sound, every breath. Minutes passed. The hall was alive with noise. And then a cough. Just one, sharp, ragged. A merchant pressing a hand to his chest. He cleared his throat, forced a laugh. But another followed. Then another. A woman set her fork down, her face pale. She pressed her stomach, her brow beading with sweat. The cook closed her eyes. Her hands trembled at her sides. It had begun. At first, the guests tried to ignore it. A cough, a groan, a hand to the belly. Someone muttered about the wine being too strong. Someone else laughed too loud, trying to keep the celebration alive. But the noises grew. Chairs scraped against the floor. Silverware clattered as a man doubled over, his face twisted in pain. His wife screamed, the sound slicing through the hall like a knife. All at once, the feast dissolved into chaos. One man vomited across the table, crimson wine and bile staining the white cloth. Another fell from his chair, his limbs thrashing. A woman staggered back, clawing at her throat, gasping for air. The chandeliers swayed as servants rushed in, their faces masks of terror. The cook stood frozen in the kitchen doorway, her heart pounding. The room that had roared with laughter now echoed with screams. "Get a doctor!" someone shouted. "Fetch water!" another cried. But no water could wash away the poison. No doctor could heal what had already taken root. One by one, the mighty men of Natchez collapsed. Judges groaned on the floorboards. Overseers clutched their bellies, their eyes wide with fear. The wives wept, their hands slick with blood and vomit as they tried to hold their husbands still. The master himself fell to his knees, clutching at the edge of the table. His face was pale, his lips trembling. "The food," he gasped. "The food." His eyes flicked to the kitchen, and in that instant, the cook felt the weight of his gaze. Her stomach turned to stone. She stumbled back into the shadows, her breath ragged. The fire roared in the hearth, the pots bubbling like they mocked her. This was what she had prayed for. This was the moment she had built with trembling hands and sleepless nights. But standing there, hearing the screams, the smell of bile and blood spilling into the air, she felt the full force of what she had done. 12 men, maybe more. Women, children, families torn apart in a single night. Her hand shook as she gripped the edge of the table. She wanted to collapse. She wanted to run, but she still forced herself. She whispered under her breath, a single sentence, sharp and steady, "They never wept for us." And she straightened her back. By midnight, the great banquet hall was a battlefield. Bodies littered the floor. The survivors groaned, pale and trembling. Servants scrambled with buckets of water, rags soaked red, hands slick with vomit. But no one laughed. No one toasted to liberty. The master lay slumped at the head of the table, his breath shallow, his face gray. Outside, fireworks still cracked across the sky, showering sparks over the Mississippi. The sound was almost cruel, celebration echoing over ruin. The cook sat in the shadows of the kitchen, her body heavy, her soul hollow. She had done it. But freedom had not come. By dawn, word spread through Natchez like wildfire. The city awoke to rumors of poison, of death at the master's table. Liberty's feast turned into a massacre. The streets filled with whispers, fear, suspicion. Who had done it? Some pointed to rival families, jealous of the master's power. Others whispered of curses, of divine punishment. But in the quarters, the truth was clear. Eyes turned to the cook. Some wept with pride. Some trembled with terror. All knew what would come next. Because Natchez would not rest until it found someone to hang. She was seized before the next night fell, dragged from the kitchen by men with fists like iron, thrown into a cellar that stank of mold and fear. Her wrists were bound in chains, her face pressed to the dirt. Outside, the bells of Natchez tolled, not for liberty, not for freedom, but for vengeance. The cellar smelled of rot and despair. Damp stone walls pressed in as if the very earth itself sought to swallow her. Chains bit into her wrists, cold and merciless. Her face brushed the dirt, and a shiver ran through her body, not from the chill, but from the knowledge that every sound above her echoed the world's judgment. Outside, Natchez was alive with panic. Mothers clutched their children. Merchants whispered of curses. The Mississippi carried the scent of smoke, vomit, and fear into every alley. Word traveled faster than the morning sun. The 4th of July banquet had become a massacre. 12 dead, half the town sickened. And somewhere in the shadow of that horror, they had a suspect. She sat on the cold floor, knees drawn to her chest. Her hands shook, not from fear, but from exhaustion, from the raw power of what she had unleashed. The screams, the chaos, the crimson rivers flowing from polished floors into drains, these were not things one could easily forget. Her mind replayed the night over and over, each moment etched with precision. The clink of silverware, the aroma of spiced meats, the faces of the men as the poison took hold. But there was no time for reflection. Footsteps. Heavy, measured, carrying authority. The door creaked. A torch illuminated the damp walls, casting jagged shadows. Men entered. The master's men, faces grim, lanterns shaking as they moved. One of them spoke, voice low but sharp. "Move her," he said. Chains rattled. She was hauled to her feet, shoulders aching under the weight of both her captors and the knowledge of what awaited. The streets of Natchez had grown quiet, almost reverent, as the townspeople peered from behind shutters. They had seen the chaos, felt the panic, and whispered guesses about the hand behind it. Some dared to wonder, could an enslaved woman, a cook hidden in plain sight, truly command such power? Most quickly silenced the thought. Fear was safer than curiosity. She was dragged to the town hall, a place that had always smelled of ink, paper, and law. Now it reeked of fear. Torches lined the steps, shadows dancing on the walls like restless spirits. The master himself was seated, face pale, lips trembling with residual pain, eyes sharp with accusation. Around him, men of authority, judges, sheriffs, magistrates, watched, waiting, their gazes hungry for retribution. The cook's eyes met no one's. She stared at the floor, the stone cool beneath her feet. Every step was a reminder. There would be no mercy, no understanding, only judgment. Chains clanged as she was brought into the hall. Her wrists burned, her skin was raw where the iron had bitten. The room smelled of sweat, candle wax, and fear. A scribe scrawled furiously, quill scratching across parchment. The master's voice rose above the murmur of officials. "You," he barked, "you did this. You, the invisible one, dared to touch my family, my friends, my home." She said nothing. Silence was her shield. Her eyes, dark and steady, betrayed nothing of the storm within. One of the magistrates leaned forward, thin fingers tapping a wooden desk. "We know it was poison. Someone must have prepared it. Someone with access. Someone unseen." They circled her like predators, eyes sharp, voices probing. Each question was a blade, each accusation a fire. They demanded names, motives, confessions. They promised mercy in exchange for cooperation, but she understood the lie. There was no mercy for one such as her. They threatened to lash the rope, the gallows. They described in detail the deaths, the agony, the horror of the banquet. The townspeople's fear was palpable even through the closed doors. And still, she said nothing. Her silence was louder than any scream. The trial was swift. Word had traveled ahead, and by morning, the hall was packed. Families of the dead, merchants, planters, and officials all gathered, faces tight with anticipation, whispers of outrage rolling through the crowd like thunder. Witnesses were called, servants, staff, anyone who had been near the kitchens, the hall, the preparations. They spoke of a woman always present, moving in the background, her hands skilled, her movements precise. They spoke of a powder, wrapped in cloth, secreted away under flour sacks. They spoke of the long hours she spent near the fire, eyes flicking toward the guests as if counting time until something inevitable. The master rose, his face a mask of fury and disbelief. "She plotted this," he spat. "She delighted in the suffering of my friends. She dared to take what she could not earn. Yet, even under their scrutiny, even under threat of death, she held herself with quiet dignity. Her back straightened, her hands gripping the bench, eyes unflinching. The judge pronounced the law. She will face the full penalty for her crimes. Poison is unforgivable. She will hang." Murmurs swept through the crowd. Some nodded, faces tight with satisfaction. Others shuddered, imagining the courage it took to strike so boldly, so decisively, against a world that had never recognized her as human. Yet in that solitude, she found clarity. She relived each moment of the banquet, each gasp, each cry, each groan of the men she had poisoned. Not for malice, she told herself, but for justice, for retribution, for a reminder that she, and all like her, were human beings, not property to be traded, whipped, or discarded. She remembered the faces of the enslaved in the quarters, the brother whose back had been whipped, the sisters sold south, the friends who had whispered of rebellion. Their suffering had built a bridge to this moment. Their pain had forged her resolve, and as she traced the faint cracks in the stone wall, she whispered to herself, "They will remember." The day of execution was bright and cruel. Sunlight burned down upon the courthouse square, illuminating every cobblestone and every face. Citizens of Natchez lined the streets, some curious, some fearful, some hungry for spectacle. Merchants, planters, children, and servants alike crowded the periphery, whispering, craning their necks. The cook was brought forth, chains clanging. Her eyes swept the crowd, taking in every face. No plea escaped her lips. She did not cry. She did not beg. The rope awaited, swinging gently from the gallows like an instrument of finality. The master's gaze met hers for a single, fleeting moment. Hatred. Shock. Something unspoken lingered there. Fear. And then the sentence was carried out. The rope tightened. Her body jerked once, twice. A hush fell over the crowd. Silence that spoke louder than any roar of applause. Yet even in death, she was not forgotten. The story spread, whispers first in Natchez, then in neighboring towns, carried by servants, sailors, travelers, and those who had witnessed her courage. Years passed, and the tale of the cook who turned a feast into a reckoning became legend. Children in Natchez heard it told in whispers, parents warning them of both cruelty and courage. Travelers spoke of the massacre at the 4th of July banquet, of a woman who had dared to strike back. The masters continued their lives, their wealth undiminished, yet a shadow remained. The memory of that night, of the tables overturned by sickness and fear, haunted their celebrations. No toast could erase it. No silver could cleanse it. And in the quarters, the enslaved whispered the story again and again, a tale of vengeance, justice, and resistance. She had no name in the books, they said. No monument, no marble, no inscription. But she was remembered where it mattered most, in the hearts of those who had known chains and in the quiet rebellion that stirred behind every locked door. Natchez, the jewel of Mississippi, had trembled that night. And the story survived in whispers, subtle, dangerous, unforgettable.